The men prepared for an impact. They warned their colleagues as they heard the terrible noise approaching. After the crash, they prepared to continue, but their ears were trained for Russian attacks. They waited. Further ahead on the front, the rifles worked day and night, searching for enemy lives to turn into corpses. The drones watched over their own, spying on desperate soldiers who became targets for the artillery. It was another tense month in Ukraine, with increasingly larger Russian attacks and the battle for Sumy becoming yet another nightmare in that third year of war. The sun did not rise that morning in Kiev. All the light the Ukrainians saw came from Russian destruction, which sailed through the skies until it found its targets in the cities. It was the impact of these untimely and criminal visits that lit up the nights and mornings of Ukraine in early June of 2025. Particularly, two nights were difficult in several cities. On June 6, 2025, there was the dreadful roar of death. 407 drones and 45 missiles cutting through the darkness, aimed not only at soldiers but at homes, bodies, ordinary lives. In Kiev, 3 firefighters died, not in combat, but in a cruel trap when a second missile engulfed them as they tried to save survivors. In total, 6 souls were wiped out. 80 people were injured, many with severe burns and crushed bones. When the sun finally came out, it brought no relief. It only shed more light on the Russian spectacle that was punishing the Ukrainians. War is sad and relentless, with death as its main actor. But when civilians take part in this theater, only the foolish applaud the spectacle. Shane Hewitt saw 2 lives crushed under the rubble of a factory. In Lutsk, a missile tore pieces off an apartment building. 1 life destroyed, 30 people injured. Thermopyl burned under toxic flames, the light fading as civilians felt their throats dry up, breathing the poisonous smoke. The attacks didn't stop, only getting worse day after day. In June, Kiev and Odessa trembled under Russian attacks. Missiles tore through the sky, turning buildings into rubble. That wasn't all the Ukrainians had to deal with. Russia's power kept advancing further into their territory. The invasion in Sumy Oblast continued that month. The Russians had driven the Ukrainians out of the Sudza region in Kursk Oblast after about 9 months of intense fighting. Now, they entered Ukraine with a rapid advance, which had already begun with shelling in the villages closest to the borders. The region was evacuated due to the violence of the conflicts. The Ukrainian soldiers were trapped by the intensity of the Russian artillery. Those who prayed in thanks for surviving the first barrage didn't even have time to realize death was coming as the smoke spread to cover the moment their souls left their bodies. The fact was that the men of the 30th Russian Rifle Regiment were firing full salvos of rockets at the Ukrainians. It wasn't easy for any troops to deal with 2 projectiles being launched per second and seeing them coming down on their positions. The 20 kilos of explosives in the warheads, exploding massively in that area, broke anyone's courage. The Orion reconnaissance drones, which were used more in Kursk but rarely on other fronts, flew from Russia to the battlefield in Sumy. They fired XUAV missiles that flew for kilometers until they found their targets, like a T-72 tank and a transport vehicle carrying Ukrainian troops to the trench. Scouts from different groups, such as the 51st Autonomous Air Regiment or the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, entered these Ukrainian positions weakened by artillery. The rifles sang their song through the forest. They stealthily approached the defenses that the Ukrainians were still trying to hold. A few shots filled the woods, followed by shouts that forced the surviving enemies out of their hiding places. With their arms raised and transparent panic on their faces, they came out of the defenses unarmed. The rapid Russian expansion in Sumy was frightening. It seemed like it would be another front where the Ukrainians would lose territory quickly, just like what happened in Donetsk in 2024. That was until the more experienced brigades started to show up. One of those groups of Russian scouts was detected calmly walking through the fields by the 222nd Brigade of Ukraine. They were talking among themselves until the gunfire started coming their way. When the drones came down, one of the scouts had already been left behind as a corpse. The kamikaze's dive happened right between the three remaining soldiers. One of them took a direct hit to the body, and his closest comrade rolled away, propelled by the force of the explosion, screaming as he was struck by the shrapnel of flesh. The third one still managed to get up, starting to run quickly while his comrade crawled away. Another corpse was left to keep the other dead comrade company, and it seemed that soon another would be among them as well. The drones of the 47th were used to chasing the Russians. When they found a howitzer 30 to 12 kilometers inside the Ukrainian border, they made a low dive that turned the weapon into smoke and twisted steel. The drones of the 129th Ukrainian Territorial Defense Brigade were also there to torment the Russians. The goal was to try to stop that brutal advance by any means necessary. The torment was spread among all the men who tried to cross the Sumy fields. The cameras filmed bodies being hit near the trees or out in the open field. Many of these men were ordered to run into dangerous areas, trying to cross the Ukrainian palisades to reach a tree line. They were caught by explosions in groups or alone. Having more than one with you only served to give the drone a chance to choose its victim. Some, luckier, managed to shoot and destroy the threats before they hit them. But those were rare lives amidst so much death. The truth was that most of those men consumed by the drones suffered the blows even when they tried to escape, hiding among the weapons. The wounded rolled on the ground, crawled, or leaned on improvised crutches to escape. But the battlefield, especially in Ukraine, is not the best place for a man to nurture hopes of escaping death. Many times the Reaper is so sadistic that he fills the soldier with hope using a drone that doesn't explode, only to later collect the soul from a torn body. The air-to-surface missile, 250 Hammer aerial bombs fulfilled their ground attack mission when they were dropped by Ukrainian planes against Russian command centers more than 70 kilometers from the front line. It was a way to try to disrupt the enemies and kill several of them gathered still inside Kursk before they crossed the border. The drones alerted the soldiers of the 6th Special Purpose Regiment that there was a group of Russians trying to flank the Ukrainian defenses. They told the Russians to surrender. They wouldn't shoot anyone who came out unarmed and with their hands up. But the Russians preferred the sound of rifles to the sound of words. Grenades and flares marked the spot where the rifles unleashed death. The shooting lasted until the Ukrainians managed to enter the well-built trenches made by the Russians. The fighting continued throughout the day. Ammunition kept being fired at enemy flesh. The special operators of the regiment were used to these infiltrations in the forests. They did a lot of this kind of fighting against the Russians and North Koreans in Kursk, even getting surrounded by them and holding out. Now they were the ones surrounding the enemies. It was time to fight their advance by piling up corpses. The special forces had the most difficult and dangerous missions. Their grenades flew at the enemy for no more than 3 months, and then there was a mandatory rotation to keep the soldiers rested. 3 months fighting against the Russians was already a lot. The strain of those battles, firing ammunition to cause so much death, would drain anyone's soul. They saw corpses on the ground, fallen by the shots from the rifles that were now cooling down. The remaining Russians ended up surrendering. Finally, the Ukrainians managed to fight back against the Russian threat in Kherson. But fighting back was far from driving the Russians out. The Russian drones prevented the Ukrainian counterattack. They located in Crypt 2 a troop transport vehicle that was heading to evacuate soldiers from the trench. The kamikaze drone hit it head-on. The soldiers escaped alive, leaving the equipment in flames. The Russians from the 132nd Motorized Rifle Brigade prepared the Lancets and other drones to hunt the Ukrainians. The Lancets were powerful drones, especially against armored vehicles. The hunt for the Ukrainian defenses was merciless. The soldiers needed to take out surveillance equipment, artillery, and Kiev's fighters so that the troops could keep advancing quickly. The coordination of the Ukrainian brigades could ruin everything. There were many flights followed by explosions that kept degrading Sonlin's defensive system. The Orion drones played their part in this process. They realized that the anti-air defense system, something that had made it difficult to use this equipment effectively on the Donetsk and Luhansk fronts, was still weak in Sumy. That's why their missiles kept flying. The explosions of equipment and trench systems were constant during this period. Without better coordination between the Ukrainian brigades' air defense and the Ukrainian Air Force, the Russians would have a full advantage. In mid-June, this started to change. The number of Ukrainian drones increased even more. New brigades arrived to defend, bringing with them hopes of stopping the Russians. Kremlin's equipment was a primary target. Russian artillery was capable of an intense barrage that had been ruining Ukrainian defenses. Destroying equipment was important, but it wasn't enough just to see the metal burning in the field. The human element had to be the target of the terror of war. The tragedy of death was brought by the drones, capturing the image of horror on the faces of the soldiers who saw the propeller so close, bringing the end of their lives in the form of fire or a lasting agony that would make them crawl through the fields until their strength was finally exhausted. Under a still dark sky, the dawn of June 17th was torn apart by the roar of Russian missiles and drones, raining fire and death upon Kyiv. The rescue teams tried to help, but more and more flames came from the sky to explode in the middle of the buildings. They had to wait, trying to contain their own fear for their lives in order to continue with the rescues. These explosions spread across Kyiv in impacts that glimmered in the night, along with the terrifying booms. The attack, one of the most brutal of the month, left marks of devastation not seen since the beginning of the year. There were deaths and dozens of people injured. Many families, caught by surprise in their sleep, lay wounded among the rubble of a destroyed residential building. Rescue teams raced against time, digging through the debris in search of survivors. The Ukrainians fought back by sending their swarms of drones into Russian territory. They flew everywhere. Smoke trails began to appear in Russian cities during those first 15 days of June. By that point, the excitement over the advance in Sumy was beginning to cool down, unlike the fire in Russian territory, which was increasing. Ukrainian drones flew in large numbers. Some of them crashed near the Volgograd airbase. A bold attack by the Ukrainian armed forces hit the Savasleika military airfield in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod region, where the feared MiG-31K fighters launchers of the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles were stationed. Witnesses reported about 20 explosions, while the Ukrainian General Staff stated that 2 Russian planes, probably a MiG-31 and a Su-30, were destroyed. Russian Telegram channels confirmed the attacks, indicating that a drone training center may also have been hit. The site is located approximately 660 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, highlighting Kyiv's ability to reach deep targets in enemy territory. But that was little compared to what the Ukrainians were facing. Russia's power was a dense shadow over the country. The news in Donetsk kept getting worse, with the Russians conquering more and more territory and preparing a full siege of Toretsk and Pokrovsk, which made it seem that, at least in theory, the Ukrainian situation had a chance to improve.